Chapter 4. Le Navire et le Phare. There was no dream, only the feverish living nightmare of his liver's pirate cleansing, an achingly long, refractory night of fever sweats and sleepless spinning. The moon was half a gold doubloon, some stolen treasure buried in the land, rising through half-skeletal trees, the dark lines of their bare branches disrupted by the occasional long-suffering leaf. The whole of the world was black against the eerie light from the horizon. He turned hard on his heels, hearing a crackling sound behind him, and saw that the yellow grass, which strangely enough now had a silver tint, was a path which led into another corner of the woods. He rubbed his eyes and then rubbed himself, but the coat he was expecting to feel wasn't there. His hands had black cotton long johns he wore to sleep. He looked down and saw his bare feet looking back at him. Where was he? He rubbed his arms again. There had been unseasonable snow 2 days ago, and now the days were unseasonably warm. But warm or cold, the thin cotton wasn't gear for the climb. Somewhere behind the darkness that the moonlit path pointed towards, something bayed. Was it a dog or a wolf? There was no way back but forward, he mused, and plunged into the strange silvery gold trail of trampled grass. In the darkness, he thought he could make out long, thin wires strung out through trees in a distance. But a signal line out here? It made no sense. He reached towards the pocket, only to remember that he had none. Were there bears out here? Was the rustling bramble at the edge of the grass a stalking predator, or just the wind? Shivering, he grabbed a large stick, not too heavy to make an admirable staff, ample support for his campaign. How had he gotten here? He seemed to remember a midnight squash harvest gone astray. But where had all the villagers vanished to? He pushed forward, his feet cut from the dragged, dry grass, scraped by the sticks that stuck out from the deep woods. Why would anyone have been harvesting squash so late in the year at so dark an hour? It seemed like a dream, but here he was, alone in the dark, shivering with cold, the moon's glow only just seeping through the trees that now enveloped him. Really here. He felt it. He could feel his heart pounding to keep him alert and warm, to push back against the cold that the damp cloth brought. But the moon still shone through, enough to illuminate a road that the path met, gravel and lined with rotting wood. He knew this road. Where there was a road like this, there were people like him, surely, and maybe even the bed that he just couldn't quite recall having laid in earlier that night. Pushing down the path, the musty scent of the wood, the shadows of the darkness behind the trees, the dying breaths of wind, he felt panic rising in him, an old primeval fear of the wild, and it took every ounce of discipline to keep from calling out, from running and screaming. He saw the main mess of the town up ahead. Here at last! And a light flickering in the window still. And then he did run. But as he reached the building, he saw that it had been gutted by an old fire. Scorched beams sagged, heavy with the fall wood rots, and the flickering light of the ghost now seemed an evil omen. What had happened? The panic rose in waves now, every breath threatening to bring it pouring out in screams and cries. Had he missed a red raid? What forces had moved the hands of time to rot the sturdy wood here over a single night? Had he hit his head, slept for 1,000 years while the old world had tumbled down around him, been ripped through a wrinkle in time? Had an alien force possessed him? Were there raiders or monsters or things still worse out? He did start to jog now, forcing the fear into his legs, turning it into energy to fuel his numbness, panting out what was left, like the sweet smell on a drunk's breath, down the old road towards the farmstead he had been put up in. And like a dream, it fell together. The old mess, which had burned down a decade back, was in his distance. The new mess, the one he knew, was dead ahead, and the flickering lights in the orange squash, seasonal decorations of the village, gleamed at every homestead. He crept in through his bedroom window, left strangely open, dove into the warmth of the feather bed, didn't even stop to leave his damp clothes behind, snuggling into the deep folds of down, into the bliss of oblivion. The loud whine of a steam whistle, station stop in sight, woke him. From the little lamp in the cabin, he could see that the sun was gone, and with the new moon, the night sky was black satin, and the stars were dancing ruffles in the velveteen fabric. His pocket watch read 20 hours 30. Judging his belt slack enough around his summer gut, he decided he could afford to explore the menu's farm offerings, and duly hauled himself out towards the dining car. Schindler Thyssen Mountain River Rail Line seemed to have been able to evade the privations of the smallholder farms and thieving red bandits for this meal at least. Hearty descriptions of thick cut homestead bread, cheap beans and beet syrup, and fried flank steaks posed alluringly on the meal list. The bread was fresh out here, not like the flaccid starch of the capital, black, dense, and full of the rye taste, which let him escape with a pretense of a quality diet that cheap white flour would not have allowed. Well, if the rail lines weren't being fleeced by the farmers, they must have had to make it back fleecing the customers. He managed to refrain from ordering a bottle of wine. God's grace, he muttered at the thought of a drag filled, poisonous drink, and instead asked for black tea with lemon, an old local taste. The next stop of the line arrived before his order, and so he sat pressed along a stiffly starched white tablecloth with three empty chairs, silence mixing with the flickering lights that appeared from the dreary endless plains, drabber for their autumn browns and the fading violet twilight. An officer couldn't pretend to miss company, especially not that of a crowded farm table, he reminded himself, that he had so recently scorned, especially. So there he sat, looking as regal as possible, alone, all dressed up and nowhere to go. A little exodus from the town of Yellow Hall boarded the train, families, young men, and what must have been the brothers younger still, of young men. Brides escorted by brothers bound for farms on the edge of wilds, fort postings and trades in the big city calling out. Evidently the harvest was swell here, as they were mostly headed down past the meals towards private cabins, though a few vagrants peeled off for the general seating. Following this most proper group of farmers and families were those who sought their recourse in more dangerous work. Men with thick bed bundlings carrying their tools, pickaxes, saws, hammers, ropes, and rifles. Soldiering, overseeing mining, lumberjacking, droving, whatever needed to be done that the chain gangs and slaves couldn't be trusted with. Maybe even joining the plague of Reds who thieved along the far frontiers. Then the assorted collection of characters who had fallen out of the bottom of bourgeois society, dregs at the bottom of a barrel of life streaming towards the terminus of civilization, reeking of booze and cheap tobacco. Most had the good sense to unroll blankets and doze off in the public seating. Proper society, with money and few children, hesitated, wavering, then attracted like a moth to a burning flame, came to the dining car. It seemed like quite the push to the frontier this season. More people leaving than usual, filling every table in due course, guilty stragglers even imposing themselves at his own. Relief at not being a pariah, annoyance at the quality of his neighbors. First, a bedraggled man in a long ago iron suit, lines aside in desperate need of cleaning, sat, In a rather thick southern accent, he loudly declared to find a seat looking empty enough for me, and I certainly therefore don't need let such a thing go to waste, eh? Before introducing himself as a doctor. No name need follow. Bound to the aid of little towns in need of health, although from his yellow and flabby face it would seem his advice had been ill placed. He was joined at the cramped table by a woman, rather too nicely put together to be traveling with the doc. A half second behind her was another woman, whose nose implied that they were sisters, to complete the set of four. Doc, calling himself Dr. Burke around the fairer sex, evidently was not married, given the gaze he cast at the woman who sat. Joe tried to keep his gaze from lingering across the shape of her cheeks and her strong, dark brows, away from the shoulder line adorned in white fur, directing any questing notions towards that still absent plate of food. A reflex followed this mental exertion, and he extended his hand across the short table to the doctor, the copper haired woman and her darker sister squeezing a bit too firmly at the end. The woman was polite enough to match his folly with her own soft comment. A firm handshake, sir. Her sister's eyes flickered a glance between the two of them, then at the doctor, lingering there rather with contempt, if he had been capable of paying attention. Joe sat off, turned off kilter for a moment, staring at those eyes, her mineral gaze of gray jade, with a look that must have been blank or confused, equally perilous and terrifying cliffs. He could only hope it didn't seem worse. He found that they had locked gazes and were staring at themselves, but his mind had shrunk rather blankly, and it took every ounce of inborn manner to force a small smile out. Deep at the back of his brain, the impression that her eyes, somewhere between slate gray and pale blue, but if you had asked him, he would have guessed olive or simply black at the pupil, and nowhere did a real color permeate his conscious thought. She couldn't have met his gaze for 10 seconds, but it could have been 10 minutes of silence, and the dance of sizing each other up. His heart began to beat suddenly, hopefully, madly. Of course, all his plans never accounted for spontaneous fits of idiocy, so it was fortunate that years of misuse had fried his brain. Where are you folks headed? His dumb mouth spilled out. Folks? Where'd that hickish vernacular come from? The good Burke sort of saved him in a brusque and slightly soused fashion. Out west, some ranch towns, that kind of thing. They're unmowed my practice back in the capital. Me! He shook a thick thumb towards himself. And after all I did for the warrior, he shook his unshaved jaws. But hey, kid, I already said this. These hay drinkers just can't listen. Burke leaned out towards the aisle, caught in a manic, spasmic moment, spilling from his stainless hip flask. Hey, warrior, you got any kind of schnapps at the bar? Huh? I can pay in silver eagles, too. Copperhead curled her lips slightly and dove with vigor into her menu. Her sister's eyes seemed to be alight with mirth. The woman spoke up at last, her voice a little low and a little rough. You can call me Ilona. This is my sister, Annalena. Our husband's services are coming to an end, and we hope to join them prospecting in the mountains after. The mountains? Joe asked, taken aback. Those are pretty savage, you know. The army doesn't really hold them, even. Lots of reds and bandits and bears. Oh my, she responded, a laugh lurking beneath her exclamation. I think, though, that there isn't protection money can't buy, and dropping her voice lower like a conspirator. They say there's gold in those hills. This time she couldn't keep the mirth down, or at least in the pants of the miners. There was something irresistible and charismatic about her, and yet how could he not feel illness in the drive to push ever further out into the mountains and hills of refuge for the people they'd shoved off the plains, cut down forests, and hunt animals looking for gold. He thought about what he'd seen done in the shadow of those peaks. Her eyes drew his back to them, pools of sweet recognition, enthusiastic, dancing and alive. Had she really said husband? An extended and awkward gaze, one he tried to keep his sadness from, was avoided by the waiter's prophylactic arrival, bringing schnapps, a bowl of rye bread for the table, and the steak and beans at long last. He tried looking at the meat, anything to avoid thinking about those eyes. It had been a long time since something like this had happened, and of course it was, well, he cut a nice strip off the steak, wet and pink. He couldn't stop himself from glancing back at her, like he was just a kid again. And she turned away right as he glanced at her, or she never even looked. Just as he was starting to have fun torturing his heart, through the mouthful of steak, she caught his eye with her own. He felt tired and sick, and his old heart song, meat turning ashen in his mouth, played on. Some ballads were better left achingly unreal dreams than facing the vicissitudes of real life. He felt unmoored in space, vibrations from the carriage wheels pounding steel on steel, steel on steel, his arms stretched out across the table to the little salt bowl at the end. Steel on steel, steel on steel, steel on flesh, flesh on salt. It had been a while since he had supped in such close company on a train, so it was an understandable misstep. Unfortunately, the good doctor was at that moment also reaching a decrepit arm for the big brown bottle before him, and the next jolt of steel was a bigger misstep yet, a collision spiraling further, soaking Ilona and her beautiful furs in the syrupy liquor. Burke immediately blustered his way out of the situation. "You damn navy fool! I'd love to see you try and stand on a boat." Disheveled sleeve wiping at the gray whiskers around his trembling pale lips. "My snaps was right there. What were you gonna do? Look what you done, a whole bottle just gone to waste." Those jade eyes held no mirth, and for an instant he wanted to deflate into the greatcoat. Be a man. Are you all right, my dear neighbor? He asked, trying to invoke the spell of her name, failing. "Oh, look here, Miss Alona, I'm sure there's a stevedore or some sort of someone on this train to see to you. I'll make sure your fine dress is properly handled if you." "Why, no, my dear officer. I rather think your hands have done enough to my furs." She began to rise, exhibiting cruel vigor and grace in a fur-clad movement. "I can see this isn't the company we might have expected from someone in such a gaudy peacock of a uniform. Are they letting anyone get gold braid these days?" And with that note, left stinging like cold salt spray, she and her sister departed without even having ordered. At the frost-glassed door of the compartment, he saw Annalena shoot him with a foul look, and then he and the doctor were left alone with the schnapps-soaked spread as the wheels turned onwards below. Although he wanted to do nothing of the sort, would have preferred the comfort of a hypo in his birth-clean's linens, decorum, and there was still the decorum of proper life in a dining car, in a train, even moving out through the hinterlands of civilization, laws and customs dictating that as the superior, at least in his mind, with doctors you could never be sure, he was bound to repair this. His sense of decorum, anyway. Well, truthfully, even in the cities, few really had use for that kind of thing anymore, outside the rules of the game. So he had another bottle of the brown prune liquor brought over, and he tried to rinse out the unpleasant events with little glasses of the simperingly sweet drink. He knew he could get a bad drunk on, especially when he left himself alone, but in civil public he was still capable of holding himself to a limit, hard practiced and learned through his closely policed youth. A strategy of tension, as it were. to keep himself high strung and never more than moderately inebriated. But that required the tension to be drained, placing the pustule of propriety and proportion in his own quarters, on his own time. The doctor, on the other hand, had no inhibitions about drink and was sinking into a state more befitting a slobbering animal than a man in a collared suit. Maybe that was why he had fallen on hard luck in the cities. Damn decorum, but you'd be damned if you ignored it too much, too. That was why civilization needed closed doors, not like the open cabins of the world outside the train. Burke, drool dripping into his scrubby beard, dipping his face towards the bottle like a stork drinking, began to talk like the old drunk he surely was. He poured out about his time in the VG back during the war days, fighting against the fire-eating slave powers. It was back, oh, I don't know, the days they were heating up on the 4th, National Victory Day, all that, and the spring mud melt had come and gone in that part of the country. Well, we were out more posse, like, than, how things were. Out there, it was, well, not untamed, like, but anyhow, all the locals, they were out trying to do wolf scams, scare us out, make like animals. Guess they must have liked their jobs overseeing the apple plantations or whatever they had. Anyhow, anyways, we'd been getting out of this orchard. Big blonde fella, Ludwig or what's it, got clipped in the arm. And he gestured here soberly above the elbow. And Chris sakes, or pardon. Anyhow, bullet must have hit bone in the artery. He dove sanguinously into graphic detail about the wound and the blood therein. I got amputated. You see, I told him this. And he said, better the half than the whole. Burke started chuckling here. But look, Doc, you swear to take no harm, don't you? He broke into a sobbing laugh and then reached for another drink. Ah, to be young like you were again. I had a sweetheart back then, but now, after I come back, he gestured to the bottle, almost knocked it over again, and took another long swig. Only true company of men out here is drink. He turned, glassy-eyed and stained like the carriage windows with rain and fog. Don't you have a story to tell, Phare? Joe felt an eyebrow raise, turned, caught a glimpse in his mind of a foxtail disappearing into the next cabbage, and decided to make his leap. None worth hearing. And then he left the inconsolate thing at the table, true company still in his shaking hands. Joe made his way back up the train, swaying gently to and fro. He felt tired and a little stomach sick. The frosted glass glowed from the fog lamps outside, autumn gold light shining on brown doors, which rose forest-like from a plush green velvet carpet. A sudden jolt on the immense iron bones below, a single gap in the continental span of their unified line, and he felt the whole compartment lurch to the left, bucking him forward. He thrust out an elbow, but it pushed something, and he fell head over ass into the mossy crush of the velvet floor. He turned back to see what he had stumbled into. He could barely find the words to describe it, but it was damp, visibly shaven arch of pure granite, hints of topaz veins somewhere below the surface, a tensed calf. His eyes started to trace up when a voice pulled his gaze fast enough to crick his neck, copper-haired Annalena smiling maliciously into his bloodshot eyes. Look what I caught, darling sister, she called into the chamber. That fish from the table. Seems he doesn't walk any better than he holds the glass. He's all laid out like a fresh catch for you, dear, just in front. Before any reply could sound out, from behind the inner door, he rushingly pushed himself to his feet, tipped his cap, and apologized to the bitch. In his stomach, he felt the bitter humor of a failed landing. That's twice I've spilled out in front of you, ma'am. I'll aim not to let a third transpire. Good night to you and your sister. As he turned and beat a shamefully hasty retreat towards his own cabin, he heard a harsh nasal, "Do you hear that, Alona? He wished you a good night." Ha! It had to have been an hour and a half later that he found himself staring into the twisting ball of tungsten filament, glowing with heavenly radiance at the front of a dingy bathroom mirror, reflecting splotches of lime on his dirty undershirt. He felt a tremendous nervous energy pervading him, and the urge to run, to fight, to do violence, to anything really. Just a great devouring force, like wind or surf, pushing him. This was another terrible pit he felt himself falling into. It was like whiskey after 10 months of hard sober work, just looking for a way to wash out of the murk, wash away the time, sweet glass after sweet glance, gazes and stares and a splashing drink around the lips, burning metric volumes of excess to illuminate a short, dark life. How had he made it so far? Well, because he expected to be burnt and dropped into the sewers at any moment, dropped from the angry hands of God. So there was really nothing for it but to fall into glasses and gazes, down into honey whiskey and sour mash and whatever crevasses leaned up towards him. He stared back at himself from out the smudged mirror, looking older than he ought to have in the electric light. Years of hard drinking in the sea sun had lined his face. Below the line of shade from his officer hat and the salt and pepper beard he had subsequently grown out did not fully erase them. He still had a good head of dark hair, at least, already streaked with gray from the stresses of the liquors and the paranoid dreams. His eyes, pale blue, flecked with spots of gray, like ice mountains tossed amidst North Sea waves. He could feel the heat of the metal coil against his eyes, dizzying him. If he was up, he was up. So he started soaking and scrubbing his uniform in the little steel basin under the mirror, and only made it halfway before the need to sleep returned. Nothing like a good bout of productive activity to chasten the soul. He forced himself to finish scrubbing it, go under the buttons and the sleeves, get out the smells and any little stains and splotches. Finally, it seemed, half in an unconscious fugue of fatigue, he got it hung over his heat vent, drip, drip, dripping, as the hot air from a boiler rushed through the countless serpentine pipes under the wet fabric, drifting to sleep with the quiet pitter of his hanging ghost beside the bunk, and the cold fall rain against the window panes. The train sped on across the night, past mud fields and farms and foot roads as old as the feeling that he couldn't name. Morning came, bringing no real respite, a slate gray horizon of mist and cloud over the austere landscapes of dry corn. Freight delays had caused the train to halt again, and the conspicuous lack of any motion and any sound greeted his pounding head, more unsettling than the sensation of constant movement, which had lulled him like the sea. He shaved and trimmed around his beard, tidied his room, putting a sprawl of papers back into his brief, tucked amidst his spare shirt, folding his sheets, searching for the pretense of propriety. His uniform, covered in wrinkles, he felt concerned enough to leave for the Steve door for an iron, and then went back to his civvies, mixed denim, well-worn plaid, and a leather vest under a black leather overcoat perfumed with rich tobacco. He had had enough of being a humiliated peacock, and desired to drink more without risking the braid. The dining car beckoned him to break his fast. Despite the unpleasant events of the previous evening, his table was still occupied by his companions, creatures of habit like almost all people. Burke was sitting crosswise from Annalena, who seemed to be focusing intensely on a fresh farm egg fried, anything other than her compatriot in dining. For his part, Burke looked hardly worse for wear. Joe called the waiter and, given the halt, managed to get some fresh cream and boiled oats alongside his egg and coffee. There was no conversation as he waited for his food. Annalena sat staring at her plate, Burke trying to hide behind his newspaper and his overcoat as he greedily sucked at a flask. and a quiet murmur of family conversations around them did little to replace the comfortable sound of the engine and the tracks. His meal arrived, and then, 30 seconds later, Ilona entered, dressed in cream and green silks, intimidating in its excess as much as his uniform must have been. He felt the discomfort of his leather and denim, perfectly adequate and yet so lacking and discombobulated now. She greeted the table, maybe him, with a smile and sat, swiping her sister's cup of coffee. She blew on it, steam curling off the cup over the shapely curves of her lips and mouth. A single thin strand of dark hair drifted out over her brows, curling ever so slightly in the gray morning. Dr. Burke tucked the steel flask into the side of his pocket before handing over the paper, breathed in the smell of the fried egg next to him, and gestured for the waiter. Curious and in need of something to do while his brain warmed up for the small talk, he glanced over the news, a local rag. Of course, these days the military dispatches went out along the wires, and as long as you could get a connection, you'd be able to get your hands on orders and updates. Things like this were probably slipping into the hands of the Reds on the other side of the big rivers. It was mostly local news, wedding announcements and births, a column on a fracas at a local town election, one party bigwig or another trying to manipulate votes and keep the place unincorporated. There was an astrology column, which was, of course, wretched superstition, and yet always a little titillating, as all things devilish tend to be. He was browsing this, looking for a sign in the stars to riddle out his place on earth, when the ladies evidently grew bored with the rather lacking conversation. What's in the paper then, officer? Well, there's local notices, town meetings, politics, that kind of thing. His bluff was unsuccessful, as those were clearly on the outer sheet facing them. Ilona leaned across the table, putting a hand, which felt heavy, fingers almost wrapping around his sleeve, peering over the top of the page. Astrology. Don't tell me you put any stock in that sort of thing. Well, it's a guilty pleasure, you know. It's not real, but if you believe in any hookum like that, you should put it in reading hand lines. There's a real part of yourself. Well, I'll let you know when newspapers start reading hands, he replied dryly. Oh, but Ilona reads palms, Annalena interjected. A distant relation is said to have been part gypsy. Joe tried not to visibly recoil for a second, but remembered the weight of the hand resting on his arm and relaxed. Well, what do you charge? He almost said, and added, Gypsy woman, before deciding against it, for a hand reading, trying to fill the hole left there. Only a firstborn child, she mocked. Come to the cabin sometime and I'll give you one. She released his arm, which sat on the table, still, yearning. Ilona got her cabin ready. Dusk was approaching through the October haze, and piles of dead leaves, drab and wet alongside the shining steel of the track, mirrored the grim overcast. Drizzle and mist set an appropriate atmosphere for this kind of thing. She put on a long shawl of red wool and a black veil. With the train still stalled, she thought herself safe, setting a long beeswax candle alight. Ready to go, she entertained herself with a book of French poems which fit the mood, odes to dolorous gray skies, depressed lusts, spurts of dark frenzy, chants of the rhyme, and all kinds of the evil flowers of the soul. Annalena, who was purporting motives that may or may not have been tangible, had left the cabin to sit in the observation car, leaving strict orders not to leave the place smelling. How? A knock, nothing remarkable about it, sounded from the wooden panel of the door. Come in, wayward traveler, come in. And he came. He had a look that was both sallow and dark, lean and tormented. He had changed from his ludicrous motley and was back in his flattering officer's uniform, blue like the sea and sparkling with gold. Something fluttered somewhere when he looked at her, the gaze of a sad dog on his face. Here, sit here. It was only a wicker train chair, but something about it added a false antiquity to the chilly atmosphere. And lay your left hand flat on the table, palm facing up. The hand on the table was smooth and uncalloused, well articulated figures haunted by shades of ink that couldn't be washed out, like memories of a bruise. Evidently, the Navy life in this modern age wasn't so reliant on pulling rope. She took hold of it, pulling it and spreading the palm open wide, unfurling the fingers and feeling the movement of the bones and the tendons of the thing. The burning blue eyes, deep set under salt and pepper brows, stared at her, curious and unnerving, hidden shapes beneath the iris. She concentrated on the lines etched into the hand, drawing herself close, close enough for the skin beneath to feel her breath. You have a strong head and hard line, well worn. She moved her thumbs along the parallel arches, massaging with expertise as the lines arched away from each other. But they diverged, pulling in opposite direction. The hard line, in the end, it is the stronger. She stood up and repositioned her chair closer to him, smelling alcohol, maybe just aftershave on his face, and the scent of fresh soap on his deep blue uniform. Look down here at the base of the palm. She brushed her wrist against his own. These two lines which shoot off. This, on the right. Do you see it? She traced it. He nodded, leaning forward, brushing the stiff shoulder of his jacket against her own shawl covered body in the most delicate way, a solid presence at her side, breathing along with her. Was he trying to match his breath? It was off a beat or two, but she refocused on the hand. This is the solar line. It forecasts. And then it struck her that this wasn't the solar line, in fact, and she had been hasty. The man had no solar line, strangely absent, and instead his fate line stretched ominously out alone before a sudden break. Could she admit this error? A life in the sun, a life of celebration and acclaim. She looked back at him for some reaction, trying to read him as she read his palm, looking at those blue, unblinking wells which gazed back. Committed now to her lie, she now had to find something for a fate line. She seized on a convenient split in the arching lifeline. It wouldn't have passed anyone who knew much about palms, but this was a gamble she would take with someone who blushed at the mention of astrology. Here we can see your lifeline, spurting off short as the great arc merges with the spread of the line of fate. She paused to collect herself around this mistruth, so small in the grand scheme of the universe, so inescapable when it was an issue of destined truth. Perhaps the neurons are showing that in pursuit of a great destiny favored by the sun, your line will be snipped early, or perhaps diverge from family towards a certain destiny. She softly traced the line swirling over the base of the palm and the thumb, pressing the hand flat against the table and feeling the warm flesh like soft putty under a dancing, gliding figure. A tragic palm, cursed by fate. She looked back at his eyes, walls of blue, glazed and iced over. Nothing I don't know already, he said, and it felt mechanical, stiff lips moving with a well trimmed wall of hair around his face. But then again, maybe that's the point. All signs for the future always point to some tragic end. Well, let me. And he broke off with a nervous tick. Watching his tired visage was like seeing the mechanisms of clockwork behind a glass face. Punctual and meticulous in his ticks, transparent as could be, so similar to the tidy facade he had put on for her with his dress. What a tightly ordered life one would have to live aboard a ship. The gears clicked and ground beneath his eyes before striking 5. Offer a coffee or a wine to finally perform a reading as this one. But it was a stilted offer, abortive and desperate in its delivery, almost insincere, but authentic to the lines on his hand and his brow, and she felt strangely warmed by his formalism and his archaic temperament. She nodded, the shawl dipping perilously towards the candle before she straightened herself out. A coffee, perhaps, or maybe warmed gull wine and tales of the East for a lady whose own destiny lies that away. His eyes glazed over with ice again as he pulled back from the candlelight. The train windows were covered with the lick-spittle frost from the wet fall weather, mixing with the brown wrist of leaf rot in the skeleton woods around the train. Somewhere beyond them, back in the cornfields, the harvest was ending, and the little people would have been baking bread in Thanksgiving after a hard day on the combines. The worn mahogany varnish of the bar held stains of 100 long past conversations, woven into the warp and blister of the sheen, stained with 100,000 little spills and spatters. Ilona ordered a coffee a la turque, seasoned with anise, while the Navy man took a simple cup, jet black and bitter. The server was Hungarian, and not immediately engaged with anything besides the aromatic steam from the bone white porcelain, and she struck up a conversation about the old country. My father was a Hungarian cavalryman, she said, gauging Josiah for a reaction, but he gave none, only staring into his coffee. He came from Klausenberg or Golesvar. The server nodded. He knew the place, but only by name. He was the second son of a peasant, and had hoped to work his way into a plot of his own, something to work out on this new frontier. This comment animated the man beside her. Whereabout are you looking? He asked in a coffee roughened voice. The server said he dreamed of somewhere out on the southern plains, less to worry about in the winters. He shivered at the idea of her mountain enterprise. Well, Josiah started, you ought to be careful. Lots of real Geronimos out there. Reds and Amazons who'll scalp a man. A woman, too, as soon as look. There's still plots in more civil places, and better for your health there. Worse for the wallet, though, sir, and I'm sure brave army men like you will be there for us. Josiah's face went disturbingly blank and still. Then he looked up at her, piercing her soul with his eyes. But what about you, Faelona? Aren't you bound for some gold mining with your husband? And she wondered what he thought about her husband. She loved Daddy, of course, really and truly. But while this Navy fellow was not really a ladies' man, Addie was no man at all for a lady. Perfect for a woman like her, really. Perhaps that was why she loved him so fully, enough to follow him on his wild idea of setting up an entertainment house for what he promised was a rising tide of miners who would have gold to spend and little to spend it on. Why not bring in some other women looking for new lives, maybe manumitted slaves, offer them a chance for a new profession in a new world out there? The idea was, she found it grand and embarrassing, a little like talking about her husband with his other men. They sat there, comfortably silent, as their coffees ran down the pale porcelain beneath, lost in thought, taking nothing more than the occasional glance. She thought about taking his hand and leading him back to his room, to spend some time lost in silence and whispers, wrapped in each other's alien arms, the pleasure of human warmth. No more two souls in an impossibly intimate, cold non intimacy. It was natural and good to do, but what? She felt a shiver of cold and wondered if there was any power in a lie, in making the lines out to be something they weren't, and weaving destiny out of whole cloth. Waves of night black coffee rose, crashing in red brown crests against the porcelain white cups, sand staining the edges and the plate below. A jolt of 10,000 charging horses broke forth as the train leapt forward. Like a comic moment in time, the coffee cup to her left tilted precariously and then dove towards her. Like moving through a pool of mud instead of time's normal crystal stream, she fumbled for the leaping china, catching it around the rim, barely splashing her fingers with the heated liquid. No sooner had she begun to grip the cup than she found her hand locked like iron, caught in its turn by the clumsy officer beside her. Like a live spark running along the iron tracks, bringing the charging steel wheels into connection, a flare of energy, heat, frisson passed through the brief connection and circuited back into their intertwined gazes. She lay her head against his undershirt, and she thought about his fate line, broken early, his chest pulled in and out against her pressed cheek, breathing in his smells, sandalwood soap, sweat, faint tobacco, sulphur, clove oil for congestion, sallow and pale like a distant corpse, perhaps, maybe, but warm arms still wrapped around her, holding her. The train had stopped to let the freight pass the narrow trackway again, and the only movement was the slow rhythm of human breath. A shiver passed through her. Was this what they would be like out there at the end of the world? Was this life worth it for the freedom and the money life they could bring out in that distant land? They had lain in the darkness, cuddled and huddled for a while, speaking in murmurs, keeping each other company and nothing else. Soft whispers fading into the still night of the stopped train, witch lights casting their pale glows out onto the drab fall fog outside the windows. Their conversation had been like a trip into a maelstrom, a whirlpool, pulling inexorably down. Maybe he was as doomed as the lines on his hand read. Maybe his fate already had been shorn short by the Norns above. His breath still came, pulling in and out, like the tides he must have known so well. Slate-gray dawn was only starting to rustle from behind the veiled and starless night when he brushed his rough, stubble-bound face against her forehead, kissing her and pulling her in. An impulse to pull him to her, to caress him, came and went like a shooting star. It was nearly dawn, and Annie wouldn't care for that. The chance had come and passed in the distant, prune whiskey soaked dark, an undestined event that had never been put into flesh. It's too late. I have to make myself ready for business in the lake town, purchases and bargains for the frontier, she whispered, almost sadly, into his ear, soft hairs on his skin dancing to her voice. A slight, laughable sigh came from below her neck. In a different life it might have been tragic, but as it was she struggled to contain a derisive chuckle. Instead she stroked his head, the ever-caring hostess. Thinking of the fires, that voice beside her breast murmured, muffled by a linen veil of cloth. Think of the dangers. Typical man. The mountain valleys will stay warm, silly. Then on a bit of defensive note, I can handle myself. Don't you think I've done legwork for all of this? His next sigh was even longer. Behind it, like behind a crush of water at the center of a vortex, there was a hidden meaning that wasn't anything but forces in the churning mail of water, meaning that danced and crushed. She rolled her eyes. Whatever it was, moralizing churchman, patronizing soldier, insecure professional, traumatized infant, there was nothing new under the sun. The sun. The slate gray of dawn was leaking steadily into the dark sky. She let herself lie there for a moment, lingering in intermingled breaths and limbs, and then, cursing and cutting at the passage of time, she rolled away. Below the bed, an empty bottle, clear glass rippling in the dim light of the comfortable cabin around it, like the heat of the furnace pipes in the cold morning. She grabbed it, folded it into the thin, ink-stained hands of the man in her bed. Take this when you go. I don't want Annie to know. The fates alone knew what a headache of haranguing that would provoke. His eyes, streaked red under dark brows, stared like a dead man towards the ceiling. Then he stiffly jerked a nod and vanished into the gloomy pre-dawn towards the door, leaving only a slow, chilling spot of warmth beneath the woolen blanket, leaving her alone to drift towards hazy rest.